you want to talk about theology? Like I told you, I don't do theology on purpose. But huh? Well, but magic is. You ask about magic. C.S. Lewis said magic is really neat. The problem with Rowling is, where does the magic come from? There are two things. There's magic and miracles. Magic, according to C.S. Lewis, comes from within creation. Miracles come from outside of creation. What is outside of creation? From God. Miracles are great, but the problem is if you bring up magic, what do you got to talk about? Better talk about miracles. So, yeah, it's the only problem is poor old, and Rowling's got cute books. That's why, she's really a popular author. But, where's that magic come from? All that mystical power. Anyway, Tammy pointed out, and this is true, okay, I called Peter Rock. Okay, if you remember way back, this is when we were looking at chapter 1, when we met Simon Peter. And I'll set it straight. What happened to my thing there? I'll set it straight. Why did it move? That Simon is a Hebrew name. It means to listen or hearing. It also is Greek. It means flat-nosed. So it's really interesting. He has a name that is both Greek and Hebrew. And one it means flat-nosed, and one it means listen or hearing. So did he have a flat nose? Yeah, was he a boxer? Well, if you remember when we looked at Mark, I told you that the terms that were used about Simon Peter are very militaristic terms. Jesus tells him to optio, which means to go behind me, which is really different than a lot of the word usages in other things. So anyway, I want to set it straight that, yeah, they're right. Simon means to listen or hear. When he gave him the name in Aramaic, it's Cephas. Cephas means stone or rock, and Peter means Petros. Petros is a rock. So just to be clear, when they call him Simon Peter, does it mean a listening rock or a flat-nosed rock? What I was doing intentionally is I'm slightly being ironic, because the problem with old Simon Peter is Simon Peter says really dumb stuff, and he's
talking about me.
No, you say really good stuff. But that's part of the that's the problem with all of us, right? He says stuff that you got to scratch your head, and sometimes it's more obvious than others. It's really obvious in the Greek, and that's part of the problem. So just to make sure that we're clear on that. Now there's something else I wanted to mention to you. I was asked, a few people have asked me to teach the class on truth. I've done that before, but we would have to take a break for a little bit from John. But I taught the class on how to know truth. Basically, the tools to know truth, because, we talk about them in these classes because it's Greek. Now, I hate to take a vote, thing, but would you guys be interested in me taking one break for a semester to teach the class on truth, since it's the election year? It might be worthwhile. I see people.
Here's the deal. Okay, I just have a question.
Yeah.
One is the person that has requested it even come to the class.
Well, they said they would.
And would you get garner more people coming? And could you do it? Are you going to be able to finish the truth before November 7th or whatever?
No, I won't finish by November. It'll be the next semester. What does the next semester start in September?
September, October, November, December, yeah.
So it'll be overlapping.
So I just don't know if it's going to be as effective as this person.
They were interested, and I don't necessarily.
Could you do one session Sunday?
I could,
Didn't we get to do it once in the sanctuary?
Yeah, we did it once in the sanctuary. We did it. We did it also once in the we did two classes. I did the class twice here, and I've done a class before in other places.
But you were in the sanctuary when you did.
Yeah, the one time we did the sanctuary. Yeah. a pretty big group. I don't know. I see some people nodding.
It's a good class.
It's a really fun class, and it's a good class because it prepares us. It's kind of what I teach the first class. You guys remember back to the first class? 150 classes through, the first class I always teach, not necessarily how to know truth, but I prove the veracity of the document we're using, which means I use the historical method, the Greek historical method, to prove that. So it might be worthwhile to do it. I'll tell them I'm going to do that. If you guys all leave and never come back, I guess I'll switch back.
I can't believe we're gonna leave John right at this point.
Yeah, well,
That's
well, if send me a note if you're really opposed.
Can I send you a note?
You can tell me. Well,
So which are you talking about? Doing a full semester, or are you talking about a session?
Can you do it in a session?
Probably two.
I just think you should condense it and then maybe do it, and that way.
Maybe do it the Sundays up to the election, or I don't know how many there are. I'll count. Look, I'll tell you what. I'll count it. I'll propose it to do that from the beginning of the semester to the election, just before, to the Sunday before the election, and then continue in John. Would that be all right?
There you go.
And that way, because the most important are the,
I was just gonna say, we really need to vote early.
and often, early and often.
Early and often, but certainly early.
All right, apologies for my lateness, but what did I miss?
Well, someone has asked me to do the class, How to Know Truth class, the next semester. And we're kind of, debating. I'm great with John, but someone asked me, and if I did maybe the classes between the beginning of the semester until the election, the Sunday before the election, and then we continue with John after that. That's what I'll propose.
It would be nice to have Parish advertise it
Yeah,
and maybe get a bigger space in this room.
well, what's slow teaching?
I don't, do you know what it is?
I don't know,
The
but
The Chosen. He's going
They're
over to
watching.
The Chosen.
I don't know. I'll propose it. I'll see what happens. If they don't like it, or something happens, or I'll ask for a bigger space to do it. If nobody comes, if I'm talking to myself, but it is a good, How to Know Truth is a really good point.
Commons right now?
We
Yeah.
asked to have that space,
Yeah.
and we were told that they're going to look for other spaces for us. For some reason, they don't want us.
Oh.
Okay.
I'll go with it.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
There
because
you
the
go.
Commons would be perfect, because that's where we've asked to
Okay.
move to. Since
We won't
Pastor
use it
Myers
to
is
say,
not
well, we'll see
there.
what
Do
say.
they have a portable? They did have a portable in the
And-
library that I was able to use too.
For some reason, they said they would rather us, we'll have another space. I don't know where that would be.
Well, I finished translating the
Parking lot's the only one left.
the parking lot. Yeah, it's in the parking lot. Hopefully, we have a bright board, right? The gym.
Oh, no.
No,
No,
the
no,
middle schoolers are in there.
no.
The
Yeah,
gym
actually,
belongs
that
to somebody
would be-
else.
Yeah, that's really, seriously.
Yeah, the gym and the stage. I'm not sure who runs the spaces.
But if somebody else wants to request the common space, that would be great, because I've already done it.
Who do we need to talk to? Well, we talk later.
Yes, probably.
Anyway, okay. So, are we clear on Simon Peter? I'm still probably calling him Rock, but that's just because his issues. But listening, or Flat Nose Rock.
Got a ring to it.
That does have a ring to it, doesn't it? What's funny about that is it literally means flat-nosed rock to the Greeks. It may be that Jesus, we were talking about this last week, right? It may be that Jesus changed his name from Simon to Peter because of that issue. Remember, there was some car that was renamed because in Central America, the name of the car was that?
Oh, yeah, that would be no-go in Spain.
Yeah, Nova No-Go. And yeah, and there was another one in Asia that they renamed the brand or the car or something because it meant something very bad in the foreign language. So maybe Jesus called him Peter because flat-nosed is not a positive thing even in a Greek society. So, branding is an important thing. So be careful of your branding, right? And anyway, we are. The most important point of this is that we are at the foot washing. Well, it's not just a foot washing. This is the Last Supper. And in the Last Supper, although John does not call it the Last Supper, but it is obviously a Seder. The other ones are more obvious that it was the Essene Seder. Essenes, because Jesus, okay, I guess I'll mention this because it's really important. The Essenes did some funky stuff. We've talked about it. The Essenes had some issues, but so did the rest of Judaism. We have Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. The Essenes in Maccabees took their ball. The chief priest at the time took his ball and left and created the Essenes. The problem with the Essenes is, what were they doing? They were sacrificing outside the temple. How do we know? Because the Essenes were the ones who did the Dead Sea Scrolls and had a lot of documents. And so we know that we know a lot about we don't know enough about the Essenes, but we know a lot about the Essenes. The Essenes met their end. The Romans eventually destroyed the Essenes, and we believe that was because of the messianic stuff that the Essenes, the Essenes promoted with the Zealots, wars, rebellions against the Romans. And the Romans were touchy about that kind of thing. They wanted their tribute. They wanted their money. But the big deal is the Essenes held to the original Torah calendar. What happened? The original Torah calendar said that when were you supposed to do Passover? The umpty-ump day after Nisan in a specific time, right? And it fell different times in the week. The first thing that the Pharisees or the Sadducees did, the Sadducees were the priests, the first thing they did in Jerusalem is they moved the Passover to when? To the Shabbat, to the next Shabbat. And the reason for that, why do you think they did that? Convenience for sacrificing, and also because the people took the day for the Passover, what were they not doing? Working, selling things in the market. The priest said, hey, we got an idea. What did America do? Almost all of our holidays, where they fall? Monday. Yeah, why Monday? Even though the holiday might fall on some other day, what do? We put them on Monday so that you have a long weekend. Yeah. And Thanksgiving's on Thursday, which means you get a really long weekend. Look, okay, you know why the Sanhedrin did it. The Essenes did the opposite. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, guess when the Last Supper is? On Thursday, the correct day. Now, John doesn't talk about that. However, this foot washing, remember I told you, John was answering the question, what else? What else about Jesus? We want to know more about Jesus. And he also was writing, I think I've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, he's writing to the Greeks and Romans. He's also writing to the Hebrews, but the Hebrews, we have a really false perception based on bad history and bad, what's the right word? Bad publicity, I guess. What is Teen Horos? It's a sect of Judaism, and how strong was Teen Odos? How powerful was Teen Odos in the Jewish world?
Before or after? I mean, like a lot of priests came over to.
You see, that's the thing, before or after. It says in Acts and in Luke that many of the priests came to know Jesus, became Teen Hodos. So you have this huge number that are Teen Hodos that are in Judaism. So Teen Hodos was becoming, we believe that it may have been, from the data that we get in Acts, we know it was at least a fifth of the men in Jerusalem, 20,000. If you remember when Acts, we evaluated that. So Teen Hodos was a very powerful sect in Judaism. Why did, the Jewish diaspora that happened later after the destruction of the temple and also the rebellion in 125, I think, that rebellion, which was an Essene rebellion and a Zealot rebellion, ended up in basically the dispersion of the Jewish people. The thing is that a lot of them already dispersed through Teen Hodos. So, it appears that coming out of the time of Christ, Teen Hodos was very powerful. But Teen Hodos really appealed to the Greeks and the Romans. And so that message moved through the world, moved literally through the Roman world and up into the European world. It was appealing for lots of reasons, and we've talked about some of those before. But
God, throughout the history of the Jews, has woken them up a few times and dispersed them, just because they're supposed to be dispersed. They're supposed to be spreading the word of God, and they keep trying to get into their own little area, and God wants to spread them out, break them up.
well,
That's kind of what.
you're right. I want to mention something really important. For some reason, we don't get history the way we don't get history's history, right? For some reason, Western history, history of civilization has kind of become a dead moot subject for some reason. What is the main characteristic of the Holy Land and of Jerusalem until about 800 AD, and what happened, or 600 AD, and what happened in 600 AD? What was the main characteristic of Jerusalem and the Holy Land? And Turkey, too. Turkey. No, it's more than that. Turkey was what empire?
Oh,
No.
That's way later.
That's way later. What happened in 600 AD?
So
Islam, the creation of Islam by Muhammad. And Muhammad literally, in his writings, he didn't write. He couldn't write. He was illiterate. But in the writings about Muhammad, Muhammad went to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, and evaluated Christianity, evaluated Judaism, and basically wanted to create a faith for his people that would bring the desert tribes together in the Arabic nations. And he did it. It was really effective. But 600 AD, what was, 600 AD, there were the great Muslim, or the not so great, the Muslim invasions. Jerusalem was what kind of nation until 600 AD? A little bit after 600 AD. It was a Christian nation. It was, and Byzantium was the Byzantium Empire. What was the faith of the Byzantium Empire? Greek Orthodox. It was Greek Orthodox.
Orthodoxy didn't happen until what was it, 1054 or something. I mean, the split didn't happen until way after that.
You can call it Catholic. You can call it Orthodox. The Orthodox claim it, and the Catholics claim it ish. The Catholics want to ignore Byzantium, but Byzantium was a huge Christian empire that was all through Turkey. Why isn't Byzantium there anymore? What happened? The Islamic Crusades. The Islamic Crusades destroyed anyone been to the Hagia Sophia in Turkey? It's defaced intentionally, and they were using it for a mosque. Now they've turned it into a museum. But that's what you do when you conquer, and they did. They conquered. But anyway, my point is this. Jerusalem was a Christian nation, and all the nations around it were Christian nations until Islam basically invaded them. So what do you think happened to the Jewish people of that area? No, they were Christians. Well, they were teen hodos for many, many years. As a matter of fact, anybody ever been to some of the Messianic Jewish services around here? I've been to a few. Dave Norris used to go to them all the time. I thought it was great. I would go to Dave because he would go to the festivals. But there are Messianic Jews. What is that group? Teen hodos, right? We're teen hodos. Except we call ourselves Christians because that's what the Greeks called us in Antioch. My point is this. Because we've lost touch with history, we've lost a lot of the concepts that many of the Jewish people became Christian. They're called Christians. They were really called teen hodos. They call themselves teen hodos all through the New Testament and only were called Christian by the Greeks. Now, John is writing to the Greeks and Romans. He doesn't use the term Christianity or, at all, because the term teen hodos, and you remember I showed you, he's got all kinds of really cool, what would you call it? They're not necessarily secrets, but he uses teen hodos. You see teen hodos, and we'll see it again, where he uses it to refer to these people that are Christians. So anyway, I want to make this point again. I mentioned it last time, but remember the last thing we were at is this one, and I think I didn't leave it, but here's the translation. Accordingly, Jesus concluded for himself, he is to whom I will immerse the morsel, and I will give him, having immersed, according to the morsel he takes hold of, and he gives to Judas of Simon of Iscariot. And this is the verse, the normal, not quite as Greek-ish translation. Jesus answered, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot. In other words, the question was, who is going to betray you, right? Who's going to hand you over? And Jesus said, the person who dips this will be the one. And the point I made, because remember, this is the context of the Last Supper. Why doesn't John need to tell us this is the Last Supper? Because we know it already from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are already Gospels that everyone is familiar with, so they know this. But the point of this is really important because the bread and potentially the wine, I made this comment that, although they did use bread to sop up gravy, you didn't have gravy when you usually had the Passover lamb because the Passover lamb was roasted and they didn't have pots. You can go into a huge thing. When you roast an animal, a lamb or a thing, do you have a pot to cook it in? Why didn't you have pots? Pots are made out of metal. The word in Greek for a coin is cut out of a pot. The reason is because metal was not ubiquitous. Today we have metal everything. You look around this classroom, there's metal everywhere. But in the ancient world, metal was really, really rare. Coins were really rare. Pots were super rare. In my book, Centurion, I've written, because historically we know that every Roman legion had 2 pots. They got 2 pots. We're not sure if they're bronze or iron. We think they were iron. Why did they have 2 pots? 2 big pots. To cook for the Roman legions. What did if you read my book Centurion, you know what the Roman legions ate. What did the Roman legions eat all the time? Gruel, wheat gruel. They got barley gruel when they were bad, but they got wheat gruel every day, 2 meals a day, wheat gruel. And you know what? They were really happy with that because they were fed. The average person, and the reason they could make wheat gruel is because they had pots. in the ancient times, we don't know this because we live in the modern era and everybody has pots. From about the 17-something, people started having the ability to own pots. Before that, where did you go to eat for your dinner every day? Every day, where did you go for dinner? If you lived in the ancient, not ancient, if you lived up to about the 1700s, 1750s or so. The inns, yeah, pubs and restaurants. Why a pub and a restaurant? What was the big deciding thing about a pub or a restaurant?
Yeah, big pots of stews.
They had a pot. Yeah, they had at least one pot. And what they did is they would make. Why is soup so important? Why is soup and stew so important in feeding people? You can stretch it out, and you can. By the way, how long does? Remember, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in a pot 9 days old? Because they did. You know, an inn might have, you know, today's peas porridge, and it's like the 8th day, and everybody's really raring because by that time it's really good, right? It's been cooking on the pot for that long, so it's really succulent. Look, we have it so easy because we have food available to us, but in the ancient times, they did not have pots. The way they roasted the meat is they didn't put it on a metal skewer. They put it on a stick, and they would, you know, turn it over the fire, or they would cook it over the fire. There are really primitive ways. I could go into huge detail because I've kind of studied this for writing purposes. But anyway, we know they were having the Last Supper. They were eating the lamb, but they didn't have any gravy. So what was the sop that Jesus was dipping the bread in? The wine. The wine.
Could it have been olive oil? 'Cause, like when you think about some Italian restaurants, you know, they'll pour out the oil with the pepper and different things, and you dip your bread in that.
Okay, it could be. However, how difficult is it to get olive oil? It ain't easy. Go ahead and try it. Butter is really easy to make. Why didn't the Romans and Greeks make butter? It spoiled. Well, one of the main statements is that it spoiled quickly. However, it doesn't spoil that quickly. One of the big fights in our family, we leave our butter out. We never put our butter away. Has our butter ever spoiled? In the history? Never. It's never. It'll make formic acid after time. It'll eventually spoil, but it's got to be at really pretty high temperatures. What did the Greeks and Romans call the Gallic people? This is great history from, what's his name? Not Romulus. The guy, Epictetus wrote about it in his books, but it's in the thing. They call them butter eaters. It was a negative term because in one of the big things in the Greek and the Roman world, it wasn't so much butter, it was milk. What does milk not do well in warm climates? It's not stable, it doesn't wait. You got to figure a way to make it. So the guys up in the northern climates, especially the Germans and the Brits, what they did is they made butter. Butter to them was like the best thing ever, right?
Yeah.
Still is. I agree.
Yeah.
But they called them butter eaters. It was a real negative connotation. It's kind of like barbaros. Barbaros means you couldn't speak Greek, right? That's what they meant when they said you're barbarian, barbaros. You couldn't speak Greek. Well, if you were a butter eater, that was, wow. Now, about making olive oil. What would you rather do with the olives? Eat them, because you're starvation culture. The only people who had olive oil were really wealthy, or they use olive oil for lots of other stuff. But oil is expensive. Anybody read the Swiss Family Robinson recently or anytime? Swiss Family Robinson, when they tried to make oil, they made oils and wax stuff. How hard was it? Yeah, they actually had to get these pots, and they had to boil the berries and stuff till they got the wax and oil, and it took them like weeks to even get enough to make like a candle. And you go, well, oil is a really similar kind of thing. Now, if you have lots of olives, but no, you have lots of starving people. So the starving people would probably whack you if you tried to make olive oil out of olives. And I'm not being
I was
disparaging.
thinking they had, like, on the Mount of Olives, they had oil presses there.
Oh, yeah. What did they do with that oil?
Was it supposed to go to the temple?
Well, some went to the temple. What's that?
Lamps.
For
Light lamps.
lamps.
People in light of the lamp. Was that olive oil?
It was for olive oil and not for illumination. That's the hilarious thing. Even the story about the 9 virgins or 7 virgins, the 10 virgins, 10 virgins. Why did they have lamps? It wasn't for illumination. The lamps weren't for illumination. The lamps were to start fires. That was the purpose of having a lamp. If you owned a lamp and you could afford olive oil or oil, right, you would light your lamp so that you wouldn't have to bank your fire. Why do you think I know, I'm sorry, I'm going down rabbit holes. Why do you think that Israel, the Jewish people did not want to bank their fires? Yeah, tribute to Hestia. Because when you bank the fires, you would put the Alpha and the Omega. They really wanted them not to do that. Because the Alpha and the Omega was the sign of Hestia, and it was a libation to Hestia. And, okay, remember, these guys are Hellenized. They are so Hellenized. They're so Hellenized that more than half the disciples had what kind of names? Greek names. So what did you do if you were a person that banked their fire to keep it going through the night? You put an Alpha and Omega on. Why? The same reason that we put, we don't do it so much anymore, but a black cat, right, walking under a ladder.
Hey, we still don't have a 13th floor
Hey, it's superstition. And the people that are Hellenized, guess what? When they bank the fire, Alpha and Omega, to the point that what do we assert with Christ? He's the Alpha and the Omega.
But he did say that stuff.
He did. What was he doing?
He was saying, I'm the true God. I'm not.
Right. He was asserting a cultural, what do you call it? A cultural appropriation, which is a great cultural appropriation, because he was saying literally, I am like the Titans. Because Hestia was the last Titan alive. So he was saying, I am like the Titan. And guess what? The Titan, Hestia, was always given libation. And you can't forget this. What is Easter named after? Hestia. It's the festival of Hestia. We appropriated it. It's cool. You can say Christ appropriated. I think it's a better way to say it. Anyway, the important thing about this is the Eucharist. And I don't think, I'm not disparaging. That is a great comment. It could have been olive oil, but I bet it was wine. How do I know it was wine?
Well, we know they had wine. It was more common and less expensive.
Yeah, and the wine was, I got to remind you this. Remember, they had barley beer. The barley beer was considered the best way to eat barley. And barley beer had what on top of it?
Bread.
Chunks of barley bread, because barley beer is made from barley bread, and it had chunks, because they thought the best thing ever was to have chunks of this barley bread floating in the beer, which I wish somebody'd make it. I'd like to taste it once, right? What do you think they thought about wine? What's the best way to eat wine? With bread. Because why? What was the problem with most of their wine?
Wasn't it more watery than it is today? Like it was less alcohol, less strong.
less alcohol, less strong, although still around 10% or so of alcohol. But the problem is it had all kinds of junk. Ephora, you know what Ephora is, right? Ephora has a, yeah, they have the Greek vase, right, that you put wine in. They're really pointed at the bottom and they come up like this. Why are they pointed at the bottom? It catches the sediment. Yeah, it catches all the junk. Today we have really cool ferment. Back, not even when I was a young person, when I was in my 20s, we were drinking wine. What do we always find in the bottom of the bottles? Sediment. There's always sediment in the bottle of a wine bottle. You always had to, what do you call it? Decant it. You had to decant the bottles because they had stuff in them. Well, in this time, they had all kinds of stuff in them. I would suspect that a lot of times they still ate it anyway, but they did try to get rid of a lot of it, and they always mixed their wine with water. They cut it with water because it did have a yucky, kind of funky taste. It was not what we would consider really tasty wine. It was amazing when Jesus made 600 bottles of wine for him at Canaan, that is in John, right? Because it was really, yeah, it was probably as good as Mogan David. Oh, maybe even better. Just saying. Anyway, I suspect that it was probably, they were dipping in wine because they were tincturing, right? Like the Orthodox in a lot of churches, we talked about this last week, a lot of people will dip the host into the wine and, eat it. And in Orthodox churches, I don't know if I mentioned this, but they take the bread and they mix it with the wine into a mush, and they serve it to each person on a spoon. And they usually don't wipe the spoon off after you, so you each get it, right? So you're all sharing. They did that for 1,000 bazillion years since Christ. Well, since John Chrysostom. Since John Chrysostom, they did it. Nobody got sick. It's probably a good inoculation. So, this was the Eucharist. The big deal is, although Jesus gave it to Judas Iscariot, why didn't anybody make a big deal about it? Because Jesus was giving it to everybody. However, that's what he said. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. This is interesting. What you're about to do quickly. Okay, here's the Greek, and here's the literal. And after the stop, Satan entered into this is King James. Jesus said to him, "That thou doest, do quickly." And meditating in company with the morsel, he came into to him the Satanus. Legea, he makes a logical argument, certainly or accordingly to him, Jesus. What you make or do, you make or do more swiftly. And here's the translation, the Greek cultural translation. And with the morsel, the wind, Satan came into him. And with the morsel, the wind, Satan came into him. Certainly, Jesus makes a logical argument to him. What you do more swiftly. Now, I think I've got
Poison. Where does that tie back to?
Where's that?
In your Greek translation there,
Poison.
Oh,
You make or poison.
poison. It's not poison. It's poison. It's poison. It's the Greek verb to make or do. It's the right here. That's why it's good to have the Greek, right? It's not poison. That's the Greek transliteration. Oh, I'm missing an E. Poison. This or make or do. This here is the verb. It's the accusative. It's aorist. Aorist imperative active form. So it would be make second person singular. So it's you make or do. So it should have an E in there. I think. Tell me. Try to transliterate this exactly. I don't mess it up.
Tachyon. Okay, I see that, like tachycardia or tachometer. Greek.
There you go. It's all from Greek, right? Including Windex. Now, what's interesting is it says Satan came into him. Here's the translation of Satan. Remember, I told you, devil, there is no devil. Diabolo means literally in the Greek to have a logos with no telos, which to the Greeks and Romans, to the Greeks especially, was an anathema impossibility. However, Satan is a specific idea. Its Chaldean origin conferred to Mabad with the definitive affix, the accuser, the devil or Satan. Now they call it the devil. In other words, it's Satan. So the word in Hebrew is Mabad. The Chaldean origin, the word in Aramaic is Satan, which is interesting. But it says Satan came into him, which is a very interesting statement. I would say Satan is already there, but, he made the choice, right? In other words, Jesus' actions apparently caused him to finally decide to do what he did, which is really interesting. What I want to really point out to you is for the early Christians, this is the late gospel, and I think a really important point that to them, I think was obvious. To us, it's less obvious. This means that a person who receives the Eucharist or communion might be stabbing you in the back the next day, right? It's not the Eucharist. It's not the body and blood of Christ. Well, we even say it in our communion, in our doctrinal works, right? What's that? The confessions. Yeah, we even say in the confessions. If it's not, doesn't work to become the body and blood of Christ without what? Without the convincing of Christ. Yeah, we call it faith. That's an Anglo-Saxon term. But the big deal is you could take the body and blood of Christ even from the hand of Christ and yet, still reject, betray. Any rejection of Christ is a betrayal, right? So I think this is a great warning, and I think that part of the problem it's the same problem we have today, right? We have people, we have churches that we know are apostate. We go, where are you going, guys? Right? What are you doing? And better be wary or wise to these kind of things, right? But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Whoa. What does the Greek say? Now, no man at the table knew what intent he spake this unto him. Toto. But not even one knew of they were reclining as a corpse or at a meal. That's what the word means in Greek. Forward to who, which, what he spoke to him. I should probably have a question mark because it's the T word. But of they were of reclining. But of they were of reclining. It's a genitive term. Not even one knew forward to what or why he spoke to him. Now, again, I want, John tells us a lot about this meal, this supper, that we don't get. I told you before, how many are there? They're just 12, right? With Jesus, 13. That's it? No, the room is full. It's full of people. It's so close that the disciples are overlapping each other at the small table. There may have been more than 12 at the table. But is it quiet? It's probably loud. They're probably all conversing. It's a Greek symposium, but it's also the Passover. It's supposed to be happy. And Jesus told them flat out, he says, the guy that remember, Simon Peter's across the table or close, but John is right next to Christ. We think this is, and the implication that Simon Peter makes is that, Jesus loves John more than anybody. And I don't think that's true, though. I think it's, when I picture this, I picture John as kind of like a little puppy dog, right? So where is John when they're all reclining to the table? Yeah, he's right next to Jesus because, okay, so John may be the John. He probably is the John who wrote the Gospel of John. But, he says some pretty disparaging things about Simon Peter, and Simon Peter probably deserved some of the disparaging things he said. But John obviously has a pretty high opinion of himself, which later we're going to find out it's a lot less high opinion because he even slams himself in a very congenial, typical Greek way. But that's interesting in itself. But I think John was like, the reason John was there is because John's like, yeah, I'm gonna get there, right? He's like that kid. He's like, he maybe even wormed his way in around the other disciples, and they're like, get back. Yeah.
Well, John and his brother were the ones that were saying, we sit at your left and right hand. They're obviously glory hounds.
Which is recorded in the other Gospels, right? John's got to remake his brand, baby, because he had some issues with that. But yeah, they're talking to one another across this small table. They're really close, and yet Jesus says, "The one I give it to." And okay, where is Judas Iscariot?
He had to be close.
He had to be really close, right? Really close. So maybe he's the guy overlapping Jesus on this side or on that side. They're overlapping each other because they're at the table. I bet you Judas Iscariot is right at Jesus' head. Right at Jesus' right-hand side. What does it mean if he's his right-hand side? Right-hand man. Shield brother. Yeah. Interesting, right? Very interesting. I should draw a picture, but it's really cool. So they're reclining. Not even one knew forward to what or why he spoke to him. In the first place, Jesus had been giving pieces dipped in wine to everyone. This was the Eucharist, and the fact that Jesus would offer this also by his hand to Judas was the indication of trust and unity with him. Matter of fact, when Jesus was handing out the bread, it doesn't say, it says specifically when he went to wash their feet. He did what? He got up, he took off his clothes, his mason, he wrapped a towel around his waist, and he went about, washing their feet. However, when it doesn't mention the Eucharist here, and it doesn't really mention it, it just says that Jesus gave them bread and wine. The picture we get from John is that what did he do? He broke the bread and dipped it in the wine. And what would he do? He'd probably pass it to the people, say, hey, pass this to Andrew, right? Lick your fingers. But Judas Iscariot was apparently right next to him. So this may have happened in the middle of the beginning of the Eucharist. So he offered his hand it was an indication of trust and unity with him. John and Simon the Rock should have known better, but they obviously didn't figure it out until later. This is the way John indicates the obtuseness of the disciples and himself. John was right there. He heard every word that Jesus said, to the point that what did he do? He wrote it down. And the average Roman and Greek reader is going to read this or hear this, right? They'll hear this, and what are they going to say? What would you say? What's wrong with you, John? Why didn't you figure this out? Because Jesus told you, and you're right there. And what would John's answer be? This is an unstated telos. The unstated telos is supposed to be an obvious thing to us, right? It's obvious because it's to the Greek and the Roman hearer of this who know this picture. Probably the people, remember, I'm telling you, he's completing the story. He's completing the message to them. They all know what's going on. We're supposed to all know what's going on. And this happens. And you go, huh? John, you were right there. And he told you. And you didn't get it, right? And Simon Peter, you're right there. And you didn't get it. You know?
It's also deep, like hindsight is 20/20 because flat out numerous times he was going to die and rise again, and they didn't get it all along. Like, they're just celebrating this Passover as if everything's going along as it always has been and always and will keep, and the triumphal entry is like, okay, this is the beginning. Like, he's going to be glorified. He's going to bring Israel. Like, they totally not on this wavelength at all until after it all happens.
I think a lot of it goes back to what we've talked about before, that Hebrew and Hebraic thought is very euphemistic, where Greek thought is very concrete. Romans are more euphemistic, but they're kind of used to living in that euphemistic kind of, they're euphemistic kind of people that take the Greek and try to gonculate it in their brains, right? The Hebrews are supposed to be rejecting the Greek, but what are they? They're totally Hellenized. They're completely Hellenized. But what's the problem with their thinking? They're deep euphemistic thinkers. So when Jesus says, I'm going to go and die, and what does old Andrew say? Well, let's die with him, right? Even though Jesus didn't say that, he said, we're going to go to Jerusalem. Well, in Jerusalem, they knew that they were saying we're going to kill him, right? So Andrew goes, well, let's go die with him.
Probably being kind of sarcastic or, euphemistic or just.
Yeah. So what did they think? What, from a Jewish standpoint, what did they think that Jesus' words to Judas Iscariot were? A joke, euphemism, not concrete. The Greeks knew what, though? If he said it, well, what do we believe? If Jesus said it, it is. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Ego, not just I am. He said, ego imi, which in Greek thought is, he is concretely saying, I am, no kidding, the bread of life. And what does every Hebrew person do when he says that? Can't really, he's not really complete, he's not physically the bread of life, he's just whatever, right? And then we have the Eucharist, where Jesus literally becomes the bread of life, which, anyway, really, there's enormously important stuff in here.
What does the word Eucharist mean? I hear it a lot. Good grace.
Good grace, yes. Good grace. Eucharist. Eu is good in Greek, and charis, Eucharist. So charis is the word we translate as grace, which really means like chow. And when the angels came to Mary, they said charis. We translate that as grace be to you, but in Greek it means chow. It means hi. Chow means hi and bye in Italian, and in the Greek it's charis is the same thing.
Some churches almost insist. To me, it seems like they use the word Eucharist.
Yeah.
A lot. They don't use the word Holy Communion as much. Isn't that right?
Because it's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's more authentic, I guess.
Well, the word church, I've told you this before, but church is not found anywhere in the Bible. There is no word church. It's ecclesia. Ecclesia is the same as the Greek democracy, as the Athenian democracy. That's the term that's used. In Orthodox, what do they call their churches? Ecclesias. Why do we call ours churches? Well, churches comes from Kyrios. Kyrios is how you talk to Mithras. Kyrios came from the Latin and Greek. It means the worship of Mithras. Why do we use that term? Because the early Christians, especially in Rome and the Roman Empire, before Orthodoxy, basically the Latin, the guys who are doing the Latin, they use the word Kyrios. That's why we call our things churches, is because it comes from Kyrios, because they took over the Mithran churches, Kyrios. Mithras is what you use for Kyrios, so Kyrios was used for Mithras. The Orthodox, however, used the term ecclesia because the Orthodox were still Greek-speaking. And ecclesia, like I said, is the Athenian democracy, which is really an important concept in the world of world. I have to say this, so we're not a democracy, we are a republic, but that's okay. We are intentionally not a democracy. But anyway, the church is the ecclesia in the thing. Anyway, we'll continue with this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go down so many rabbit tracks, but if you have questions, just ask the questions. Like I said, I'll try not to touch on theology or doctrine, but it's, historical theology and doctrine is always fair game, right? Thank you, Father, for your word. Pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray.